From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Rose Crockett. It's my pleasure to introduce to you today Susan Tejada. She is a former author and editor at the National Geographic Society, where she was also an editor-in-chief of the National Geographic World magazine. During this time, Susan was also an author and managing editor of geography books for young readers. A few interesting facts about Susan is that she is a Providence native, she's a die-hard Washington Capitals fan, and she's also served in the Peace Corps. Her book, In Search of Sacco and Vanzetti, provides new insights into the characters and context of a notorious criminal case from the 1920s. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce the beautiful and talented Miss Susan Tejada.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Rose, and all the wonderful escorts. And thank you for coming here today on the National Book Festival is an amazing celebration of the printed word. And it's truly an honor for me to be here today to participate. I spent many years researching and writing my book, In Search of Sacco and Vanzetti. I'm sorry, I'm distracted. I thought there was something else going on in the background. Anyway, looking back, it seems to me that an awful lot of my time was spent in the nooks and crannies of the Library of Congress, the institution that is behind this festival. So in a way, today feels like a kind of homecoming for me. In the first decade of the 20th century, nearly 2 million Italians left their homeland and came to America. My book is about two of them, Nicholas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Unknown to each other, Nick and Bartolo sailed separately to the United States when they were teenagers in 1908. 12 years later, in 1920, they were arrested together and convicted of robbery and murder. They swore they were innocent, but their motions for a new trial were repeatedly turned down. By the time they died in the Massachusetts electric chair in 1927, their case had become notorious. People around the world protested the executions. Hundreds of thousands of people who had come to believe that the men were innocent. 8 decades have now passed since Sacco and Vanzetti died. Much of what has been written about their case in that time has focused on one question: were they innocent or were they guilty? But the question that had been nagging at me for a long time was a different one. Sacco and Vanzetti are almost always spoken of together, as if they had been conjoined. But they were distinct personalities, and I wanted to know, what kind of men were they? What were they really like? To find out, I would have to decouple Sacco from Vanzetti. I would have to abandon preconceptions, find new sources, and follow the research trail wherever it led. I was able to locate and interview elderly relatives of people who were involved in the case, most of whom had never spoken publicly before. I found neglected and unpublished primary sources, and I translated letters that Vanzetti had written in Italian to his family over a period of more than 2 decades. A nuanced portrait began to emerge, a portrait of two very complex individuals. with Vanzetti appearing more intolerant and Sacco more reflective than they usually are described. Before I get into the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the men, especially their early lives. Nicola Sacco came from southern Italy, a small town called Torre Maggiore, where he was born in 1891. At around age 14, he left school and began helping his father take care of the family's large vineyard. A few years later, in 1908, just before his 17th birthday, Nick came to America with an older brother. He landed in Boston and settled in that area. He liked his new home. When he heard about a shoe manufacturing training program for immigrants, he decided his future was worth the $50 tuition, and he signed up. Early in 1910, the ambitious young man became an edge trimmer, a skilled worker in the increasingly mechanized shoe industry. The job required concentration and precision, and Nick was a genius at it, a friend recalled. A year after he became a shoe worker, Nick fell in love with Rosina Zambelli, a young Italian immigrant like himself. They married in 1912 when he was 21. Their first child arrived a year later, a son they named Dante. In 1908, the same year that Sacco sailed to Boston, Bartolomeo Vanzetti arrived in New York. It would be another 9 years before the two men would meet. Bartolomeo was born in the town of Villa Folletto in northern Italy in 1888, the eldest child of a farmer and cafe owner. Vanzetti recalled a very happy childhood, but when he turned 13, everything changed. His father sent him away from home to learn a trade. For 6 years, young Bartolomeo lived on his own, boarding in different cities. He worked in bakeries and candy shops, learning skills his father hoped he would bring back home and eventually put to good use in the cafe. In 1907, a few months before his 19th birthday, Bartolomeo became so ill that his father had to go to Turin and bring him home. Not long after he recovered, however, his mother became sick. When she died 3 months later, Vanzetti was devastated. He decided to leave his home and his father and to start fresh in America. He arrived in New York unaccompanied and on his own. He did odd jobs, rambling for a few years along a route that took him back and forth between New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. Unlike Sacco, he would never become a skilled worker, and he would never earn a steady paycheck. Although their work experiences in America differed greatly, Sacco and Vanzetti were traveling on parallel paths, each of them heading toward increased radicalization. By 1913, Sacco and Vanzetti had each subscribed to a radical newspaper put out by Luigi Galliani, an Italian anarchist living in Massachusetts. By 1916, each of them had taken action to support workers who had gone out on strike. And by 1917, when Sacco and Vanzetti finally met each other, they were in the process of leaving the United States to avoid registering for the World War I draft. I'm going to move ahead a few years now to 1920 and to the crime that launched the Sacco Vanzetti case. One fine spring afternoon, April 15th, 1920, a payroll officer and a security guard are walking down a street in South Braintree, Massachusetts, on their way to deliver 2 cash boxes to a shoe factory, where it is payday for the workers. As if out of nowhere, 2 gunmen suddenly appear on the busy street. They shoot the officer and the guard dead, grab the boxes, and throw them into an approaching getaway car with 3 accomplices inside. The bandits then jump into the car themselves and tear off, guns blazing. From first shot to getaway, the entire crime takes less than a minute. After the crime, a local police chief hears about a completely unrelated immigration investigation involving an Italian laborer who used to work at the just robbed shoe factory, but who is now being deported as an undesirable anarchist. The police chief speculates that this man might have been a member of a gang that committed not only the South Braintree job, but also an earlier and unsuccessful payroll heist in the nearby town of Bridgewater. By then, the anarchist has already been deported. So the police chief questions his former housemate, a man named Mario Buda. When the chief arrives the following day to ask more questions, Buda has vanished. The chief makes arrangements to nab him at a garage where he has left his car for repairs. A few weeks later, Buda goes to the garage to pick up the car, and 3 friends go with him. As prearranged, the garage manager and his wife tip off police to Buda's arrival. Buda and his friends become suspicious of the wife's behavior, and they leave quickly without the car. Soon after, police officers board a streetcar and arrest 2 of the men who had been with Buda that night, Nick Sacco, a shoemaker, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, a self-employed fishmonger. They have been caught in the trap that was set for Mario Buda. The next morning, District Attorney Fred Katzman questions them individually in the Brockton jail. The record of the interrogation first became public in 1977. It shows that Sacco asks for a lawyer. Katzman ignores the request, and the questioning proceeds. No one informs the suspects of the charges against them. Sacco and Vanzetti assume they are wanted for radical political activities. Their instinctive but ill-considered reaction is to answer Katzman's questions with lies. Police begin the hunt for evidence against Sacco and Vanzetti. They search for the stolen payroll money, but they find none. They bring eyewitnesses to the jail. There, they forego lineups and display Sacco and Vanzetti one at a time. Several witnesses still cannot identify them. In the absence of evidence, newspapers report on the men's draft dodging and labor activism. Worried friends hastily put together a defense committee. Sacco has a time card alibi for the day of the unsuccessful payroll heist in Bridgewater. But Vanzetti is self-employed. He has no time cards. Katzman makes a surprising decision. He puts Vanzetti on trial first and alone for the attempted crime in Bridgewater. Vanzetti's solo trial begins just 7 weeks after his arrest, with Judge Webster Thayer presiding and Fred Katzman prosecuting. 3 witnesses, say Vanzetti was one of the bandits at the crime scene in Bridgewater. 14 witnesses place him someplace else, peddling fish in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where he has by now been living for most of the past 7 years. Vanzetti decides not to take the stand in his own defense. A jury finds him guilty on 2 counts. The defense committee needs a new and hopefully more successful legal team for the upcoming joint trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. Labor lawyer Fred Moore arrives in Boston as a white knight. His reputation as a successful lawyer for a militant labor union, the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, precedes him. In fact, as I discovered in my research, the IWW has just fired Moore for incompetence. But the defense committee doesn't know it, and Moore doesn't tell them. Moore sets out to politicize the case before the joint trial even begins. Judge Thayer, who has already sentenced Vanzetti for the Bridgewater crime, will also preside at the upcoming joint trial, having specifically requested the assignment. Thayer and Moore are characters straight out of central casting. The conservative judge and the radical lawyer get on each other's last nerve. Over the course of the trial and beyond, their antagonism will grow to almost epic proportions. The joint trial of Sacco and Vanzetti begins on May 31st, 1921, 91 years ago. More than 150 witnesses testify over the course of 7 long, hot weeks of summer. I won't try to cover here what consumes more than 2,000 pages of the court record. You'll find what I hope is a good summary of the proceedings in my book. I'm just going to recap here very briefly the 4 categories of testimony, which are identifications, alibis, consciousness of guilt, and physical evidence. Identification testimony takes up the most time at the trial, but essentially is the most inconclusive, as the eyewitnesses tend to cancel each other out. 7 witnesses identify Vanzetti as someone they saw before, during, or after the South Braintree crime. More than 4 times as many witnesses, 31, refute them. 4 witnesses identify Vanzetti as someone they saw before or after the crime. Twice as many, 8, refute them. No one identifies Vanzetti as being on the scene at the time of the crime. The alibi testimony, very briefly, is this. Sacco says that on the day of the South Braintree crime, he was in Boston. Vanzetti says that he was in Plymouth, and several witnesses back each of them up. The 3rd category of testimony is consciousness of guilt. Sacco and Vanzetti were armed when they were arrested, and they lied when they were questioned. These facts are not open to dispute, but the reasons behind them are. According to the prosecution, the lies show that Sacco and Vanzetti are concealing criminal acts. Police files released in 1977 have cast doubt on the prosecution's arguments. The 4th, final, and in my opinion, the most important category of testimony is physical evidence. Regarding Vanzetti, the prosecution contends that the gun he was carrying had been lifted off the body of the murdered security guard, Alessandro Berardelli. However, no witness saw Berardelli with a gun on the day of the crime. No witness saw a bandit take a gun from Berardelli. And 3 witnesses testified to a completely different ownership trail for Vanzetti's gun. Police files released in 1977 imply that the prosecution knew all along that Vanzetti's gun was not Baradelli's, but suppressed the evidence. The prosecution also contends that of 4 bullets removed from Baradelli's body, the one that actually killed him, and only that one, was fired by Sacco's Colt automatic. 2 years after the trial, one of the prosecution's expert witnesses recants, now declaring that there was, quote, no affirmative evidence whatever, unquote, that this bullet had come from Sacco's pistol. 6 years after the trial, defense attorneys allege that the prosecution actually tampered with the bullet. This cannot be proven. However, if it were true, it would help explain something that otherwise is inexplicable. How it was possible that only one of 4 bullets taken from Baradelli's body could have come from a Colt, even though no witness saw one bandit shoot 2 guns, and the only witness who claimed to have seen 2 bandits shoot Baradelli did not identify either Sacco or Vanzetti. Over defense objections, Katzman cross-examines both Sacco and Vanzetti at length about their radical political views and their draft evasion during World War I, matters unrelated to the charges and to the crime at South Braintree. On July 14th, after 7 weeks of testimony, the case goes to the jury. 5 hours later, they announce the verdict. Each defendant guilty of 2 counts of murder in the first degree. Sacco and Vanzetti are sent back to their separate prisons. For Sacco, that's Dedham Jail. He worries constantly about his wife, his son, and the baby daughter born 5 months after his arrest. He becomes delusional and self-destructive. He is involuntarily committed to first one and then another psychiatric hospital. After 6 months, he recovers sufficiently to be sent back to his cell. Vanzetti is confined at Charlestown State Prison, miles from Dedham. He receives permission to study English with a tutor. This is a transforming experience for the bachelor who has usually been described as uninterested in women. In fact, as I discovered at the Boston Public Library, when I put a black light reading device over a letter that Vanzetti had written in invisible ink in 1924, I discovered a love letter. He had fallen in love with the woman who was tutoring him in English. While the prisoners struggle to keep up their hopes, defense lawyers file 5 motions for a new trial. Under state law in effect at the time, the judge who will rule on the motions for a new trial is the same judge who presided at the original trial. Judge Thayer denies all the motions. Defense lawyers are working on new appeals when suddenly, on November 18th, 1925, there's a game change. A prisoner in Dedham Jail named Celestino Medeiros smuggles a 1-sentence note to Sacco. It reads, "I hereby confess to being in the South Braintree Shoe Company crime, and Sacco and Vanzetti was not in said crime." A defense lawyer investigates the confession. He finds strong circumstantial evidence that Medeiros and a criminal gang from Providence, Rhode Island, the so-called Morelli gang of mobsters, committed the crime in South Braintree. On the day of that crime, 4 of the 5 Morelli brothers had been at liberty, awaiting trial on charges that included the theft of hundreds of pairs of shoes shipped from factories in South Braintree. Joe Morelli, the head of the gang, strikingly resembles Nick Sacco. The defense now argues for a new trial based on the Medeiros confession. Once again, under state law, the judge who will rule on the motion is none other than the original trial judge. Once again, Webster Thayer denies the appeal. Increasingly now, Thayer is seen as behaving more like an advocate than an arbitrator, and a backlash starts to pick up steam. It intensifies in March 1927, when then Harvard Law School professor Felix Frankfurter publishes a scathing attack on the prosecution's tactics and the judge's misrepresentations. In the book, I explain what was, to me at least, the shocking discovery that Louis Brandeis, then a sitting Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, helped fund Frankfurter's work on the case. And Frankfurter, by the way, as I'm sure all of you know, would himself go on to become an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. The spring and summer of 1927 fly by in a blur of sentencing, legal motions, clemency reviews, the release of previously suppressed evidence, and public protests around the world. People as diverse as Albert Einstein and Henry Ford, Benito Mussolini, and Pope Pius XI all take steps to try to save the lives of Sacco and Vanzetti. On August 22nd at Charlestown State Prison, the warden informs his prisoners that their last request for a stay of execution has been denied. Celestino Medeiros is scheduled to die that night for a different crime, along with the men he had tried to exonerate. After midnight, Medeiros first, then Sacco, then Vanzetti, are strapped into the electric chair at Charlestown. One by one, they are wired up, and their faces covered by a black leather mask. The executioner throws the switch 3 times. A single telegraph operator outside the death chamber sends news of the deaths flashing around the world. In the last chapter of the book, I take my stab at answering the 2 big questions of the case. Did Sacco and Vanzetti commit robbery and murder on April 15th, 1920? And if they didn't, who did? So you'll have to read my book to find my answer. However, I will say here that in the course of my research, I discovered some pretty astonishing new information about the murdered security guard, Alessandro Baradelli. At first, I was only looking for information about Baradelli's survivors to include in the epilogue, but I couldn't find anything. It seemed as if they had vanished off the face of the earth. I kept looking. It took a long time, years actually. But an article about my search that appeared in a Connecticut newspaper eventually led me to Baradelli's great-granddaughter, also to a genealogist who had studied immigration from Baradelli's native village in Italy. Then I found more pieces of the puzzle with help from both the Catholic Archdiocese of Hartford and the Jewish Historical Society of New Haven. The information I was gathering prompted me to revisit the original investigative reports of both sides, the prosecution and the defense. For me, Alessandro Baradelli has now become one of the most intriguing characters of the entire case. Based on evidence I uncovered that is circumstantial, but extensive and persuasive, I believe that he was coerced into helping plan the South Braintree crime, and then double-crossed and murdered by his conspirators. When I began researching this book, In Search of Sacco and Vanzetti, it quickly became apparent to me that I couldn't look at the case in a vacuum. Instead, I needed to look at it in context, against the background of social upheaval and turbulence that marked the early years of the 20th century. Sacco and Vanzetti themselves consistently blamed their circumstances on 4 distinct factors: their ethnicity, their labor activism, their wartime draft dodging, and their anarchist beliefs. I decided to look at each of these factors separately. I found that immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe had increased so dramatically by the first decade of the 20th century that it had provoked an intense backlash. Italian immigrants were the subject of criticism in the majority of articles published about them in American magazines between 1880 and 1920. 47 Italians were lynched in the United States between 1890 and 1915. The largest mass lynching in American history took place in New Orleans in 1891, when 11 jailed Italians were killed in a single night. I learned also that in 1908, when Sacco and Vanzetti joined the American labor force, non-unionized workers in manufacturing were earning on average about $10 for 60 hours of work a week. Neither Sacco or Vanzetti ever joined a union, but they did support strikes and strikers, and their labor activism was noted with suspicion by the press when they were arrested. Further, when the United States entered World War I in 1917 and authorized a compulsory military draft for the first time since the Civil War, Sacco and Vanzetti did not register. Instead, they fled to Mexico, along with other admirers of anarchist Luigi Galleani, who opposed the war. Sacco and Vanzetti stayed in Mexico only a few months, but they never could dispel their image as unpatriotic draft dodgers and ungrateful immigrants. And finally, Sacco and Vanzetti really were anarchists, and not just armchair anarchists, but supporters of Galleani, who advocated violence if necessary in order to achieve his goal, as he put it, of a communal society in a world without God, without king, without government, without masters. Supporters of Galleani were suspected of involvement in 2 widespread and terrifying bombing campaigns in the United States in the spring of 1919. Italian anarchists in America posed a limited threat of violence. But in 1919 and 1920, the threat seemed as perilous as global terrorism does today. In 1908, when Sacco and Vanzetti joined more than 750,000 people from around the world pouring into the United States, the country was wrestling with immigration reform. It still is. In 1917 and 1918, when the United States was at war, lawmakers wrestled with opposing concepts of civil liberties and homeland security. They still do. In 1919, as American workers staged more than 3,600 strikes, labor unions provoked an angry backlash. They still do. In 1932, a law professor documented 62 cases of wrongful criminal convictions of innocent people in the United States. Wrongful convictions still haunt us. Last month, August 2012, marked the 85th anniversary of the executions of Sacco and Vanzetti. The two men were anonymous nobodies when they were arrested in 1920. 7 years later, when they marched to the electric chair, they were known all over the world. Supporters saw them as innocent victims of prejudice run amok. Detractors saw them as cold-blooded murderers who were getting what they deserved. And amazingly, after 85 years, the case is still controversial. So, thank you. And if you have questions, anyone has questions, I will take a drink of water, and then I'll be happy to try to answer your questions. Okay, yes.
Yes. Have you considered the correlation between the Sacco and Vanzetti trial and the Leo Frank trial? Both was, in the 1920s, 1900s, against foreigners of some sort. And I would think that maybe Frankfurter and Brandeis might have been influenced by what happened with the Frank trial. Have you thought about that?
No, the Leo Frank case preceded the Sacco and Vanzetti case and was in another part of the country. If anyone is interested in learning more about that case, I recommend the book by Steve Oney. I think the title is "And the Dead Shall Rise," which is an excellent and groundbreaking study published a few years ago. Sure, there was, obviously, a fear of the unknown, the great unwashed unknown, was a factor in both trials. But the legal teams had no, there was no crossover. So, okay, thank you. Was there a yes?
Just a question. The cash box that was robbed was going to be distributed to the workers. Is that correct?
That's
it was a
correct.
payroll. And is it possible that Sacco and Vanzetti, or at least one of them, might have known that? And doesn't it suggest, just given the potential destination of the payroll box, that it's inconsistent that two people with their beliefs would commit that crime?
I agree. I think if they had been involved in any crime, even if it was to raise money for their cause, that their most likely targets would have been symbolic ones, a bank or a political or industrial representative. And their least likely target would have been fellow workers. That is a good point, I think. And yeah. Thank you. Did you, oh, well, I guess I should go over here.
I just wanted to know how much was actually taken. How much money?
It was almost $16,000, $15,771.
Hi. It's my understanding that the trial transcripts were reviewed by the president of Harvard University Lowell, and he came to the conclusion that they did receive a fair trial. Can you talk about, his possible motivations or, why he would come to that conclusion?
The president of Harvard University, President Lowell, Abbott Lawrence Lowell, in the final months of the case, the governor was considering clemency, conducted a clemency review, and the governor also appointed a 3-person committee to study the information and to give him their findings. Lowell was a member of that committee. The other members were the president of MIT and a retired probate judge. They didn't review the transcript of the trial. That wasn't available yet. But they did interview witnesses. And there was great controversy about their finding that Sacco was guilty, and on the whole, Vanzetti was guilty. On the whole seems not quite strong enough in a capital case, but and people felt that supporters of Sacco and Vanzetti felt that they just couldn't imagine that the judicial system of Massachusetts could be wrong and these two nobodies could be right. And there was controversy about Lowell took it upon himself to challenge 2 witnesses who had given Sacco an alibi. Lowell was subsequently proven wrong, but he directed that information not be included in the record of the proceedings. So on the tercentenary of Harvard, several alumni published a pamphlet called "Walled in This Tomb," against Lowell and against his findings, and he said it haunted him for the rest of his life. Not that he believed he had made a mistake, but that people wouldn't leave him alone. Yeah.
I was wondering what happened.
We have 2 minutes, so I guess I can take 1 or possibly 2 more questions if I keep my answers short.
I was wondering what happened to Sacco's family after they were executed.
His wife remarried. She had no more children by her second husband. She did a wonderful job of bringing up the children and protecting them, and they went on to live quite normal lives, marry, have children of their own who were quite successful in various fields. So in that sense, she was a strong woman, and the family was successful. Do we have time for 1 more? Okay, 1 more.
So I was wondering, even with circumstantial new evidence, is there any way to posthumously do some sort of a pardon or something if they were wrongly sentenced?
Well, there's no way to have a jury trial. In the 1950s, there was a hearing about a posthumous pardon that did not succeed. And in 1977, on the 50th anniversary, Governor Dukakis declared it to be Sacco and Vanzetti Day and to remove all stigma from their names. But no, I mean, to have a legal proceeding now it couldn't happen. So I think that's all. So I thank you very, very much for coming. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.